The North Sea wind lashes his face like cold blades. In the brief white flash of a flare, we glimpse the silhouette of a man running hunched along the Scheldt dike, the water up to his waist, his German greatcoat caked in mud and heavy as lead. He is not afraid of slipping, not afraid of grenades. What makes him keep looking over his shoulder, lips trembling, is a tiny sound behind him, the water being stirred in a steady rhythm by footsteps that do not stop. Die Kanadier, wieder, he mutters under his breath, the Canadians. They're here again. That month, German reports recorded a chilling statistic. The rate of failed counterattacks against Canadian infantry was higher than against any other Allied force. The strange thing was, the Canadians did not have more men, did not have more tanks, did not possess overwhelmingly superior firepower. And yet, somehow, they kept advancing. Advancing at night, advancing in the rain, advancing into exactly those places where any normal assault should have been smashed to pieces. And that is the question that opens our journey. What turned a small army from across the Atlantic into an opponent that even SS soldiers admitted was the worst possible enemy to run into? To understand why those footsteps haunted German soldiers so much, we have to go back to the starting point. Canada in 1939 was no military superpower. It was a young country with fewer than 12 million people, its economy still slowly climbing out of the Great Depression. When the war broke out, its armed forces were so small that, on paper, many German officers treated the Canadian Army as nothing more than a decorative extension of the British Empire. Yet by the end of the war, more than 1 million Canadians had put on a uniform, and in Europe they fielded roughly 5 infantry divisions and 2 armoured brigades, not a handful of sand spread thin, but a tightly packed fist. The Allied picture around them was full of irony. The United States brought to the battlefield an almost bottomless industrial might. Liberty ships, trucks, tanks, aircraft pouring in without pause. Britain had marched from Dunkirk through the deserts of North Africa to Italy. It had experience, doctrine, and scars from fighting with its entire population mobilized for years, but it was exhausted. Canada sat between those two poles. It had no massive factories like the Americans, no century-old empire like the British, but it did have one thing: time. Canadian troops arrived in Europe early, sat in Britain for years without a major battle, and used that time to train, experiment, and hone a volunteer force in which every man had chosen to sign his name on the enlistment form. In the cold, wet camps of Scotland and Wales, boys from Manitoba, Quebec, and British Columbia drilled and drilled again, shooting, route marches, amphibious assaults, night attacks, without the pressure to constantly rotate troops the way the American system did. Canadian units kept a stable backbone of officers and veteran NCOs month after month. The result was that when they finally came ashore in France, a Canadian platoon was usually made up of men who had lived and trained together for years, a compact machine so well tuned that it did not need long speeches or elaborate orders. A nod was enough. Everyone knew their job. Behind that ferocity, though, lay some very cold limits. A small population meant that every single battalion worn down in combat was a strategic problem, not just a statistic. Canadian industry could provide trucks, guns, and ammunition at a respectable level, but it could not replace infantry at American speed. In staff meetings, Canadian generals demanded big assignments to prove their nation's worth, yet they also knew that if they spent their soldiers like disposable shells, they would have nothing left to put on the negotiating table when the war ended. That is where the central paradox lies. An army that should have been cautious because its resources were finite instead built itself around a doctrine of shock infantry, assault troops that prioritized speed, pressure, and calculated audacity. They were taught that their job was not to hold a line with minimal losses, but to punch holes in the hardest points of the German defense, the places other forces could not crack. If the Americans brought an industrial sledgehammer, and the British a seasoned scalpel, Canada chose to be the sharp chisel, driven straight into the thickest slab of concrete in the German front. In the eyes of Allied high command, That created a very specific role. Whenever the campaign map showed a bottleneck, a port, a strip of defended coastline, a stone town on high ground, where every estimate screamed heavy casualties, high risk, the same name tended to circulate quietly around the table. Short, blunt, carrying an unspoken assumption. Send these men in, and the job will get done, even if the price of success makes the whole room go silent for a few seconds. On a map, Canadian infantry are just small blue symbols. But at ground level, in a German trench, what they faced was not an icon on paper. It was a completely different rhythm of battle. Every army has habits. You attack, then you pause, dress the line, wait for artillery, wait for orders. The Canadians almost skipped that step. They were trained to treat the natural pause in a fight as the golden moment to slam the throttle down. In their training camps in Britain, Canadian officers put their men through drills that American or British units usually reserved for commandos, long night marches, cross-country slogs in cold rain, practice assaults launched right after exhausting marches. The idea was simple. If your body is used to attacking when it is most tired, then in real combat, when everyone else is begging for a break, you can still push one more bound forward. The bonus of that habit showed up on the other side of no man's land. German doctrine was built on a stopwatch. They calculated how long it took an enemy to run low on ammunition, when they would have to stop and regroup, when the perfect moment for a counterattack would arrive. They knew the British rhythm: attack, take an objective, dig in, wait for tea and the supply columns. They knew the American rhythm: run into a hard point, go to ground, call in air power or a massive artillery strike, then move up behind the blast. But with the Canadians, frontline reports kept complaining about one thing: they do not stop where normal troops stop. The skyline did not go quiet again after the barrage. Instead, shadows kept creeping forward. Weather was supposed to be the defenders' oldest ally. Heavy rain, cold wind, bottomless mud, those were things that slowed attacks, broke formations, ruined plans. Yet in the Scheldt, on the flooded Dutch lowlands, Germans watched the opposite happen. The enemy accepted wading through mud and chest, deep water, dragging soaked greatcoats and packs, and still kept a coherent assault line. From their observation posts, German artillery officers saw Canadians rise out of the mist, backs bent under the weight of wet gear, but legs still moving with a steady, drilled rhythm, as if they had been born to fight in conditions that should have sent any sane soldier back into a dugout. Night fighting told a similar story. For most Allied units, darkness meant locking the guns, tidying positions, getting some sleep. Canada turned it into their own arena. They trained to move quietly, swing around flanks, close in with knives and submachine guns at distances every textbook warned you to avoid. German troops, who had always believed that the night is on the defender's side, suddenly found that the quiet hours were when they most expected to hear the splash of feet in water, the low murmur of English and French voices just beyond the wire. Many prisoners later admitted they were never sure a sentry shift was truly over when Canadians held the ground in front of them, because even at the time of night, when everything should have been still, there was always a chance a small patrol was crawling closer. Training also showed in the way they worked in small units. In many armies, platoons and companies operated like separate links in a chain, waiting for detailed orders from above before doing anything big. Canada deliberately grew a tier of NCOs and junior officers who were allowed, even encouraged, to seize any opening they saw. If they spotted a gap, they slipped into it. If they saw a machine gun nest expose its flank, they went for it without waiting for the whole battalion to line up. Germans, who were used to reading the battlefield in big arrows on a map, suddenly felt they were being eaten from the edges by a swarm of small, autonomous ant colonies, and that feeling of being nibbled at from all directions shredded the sense of control they once took pride in. There was one more detail, small on paper but large in German memories. Canadian units almost never aborted an assault just because the first wave took heavy losses. They might change direction, slide around a flank, try a different angle, but they rarely went all the way back to the start line. That did not come from a disregard for human life. It came from a lesson drilled into them in training, that the last half step, the short stretch after everything looks like it is falling apart, is often where the battle is truly won or lost. They refused to give up that half step just because instinct screamed at them to stop. Add all of that together, long, ruthless preparation, the ability to function in savage weather, a habit of fighting at night, and strong initiative at the lowest level, and you get the first decisive factor in German fear, an infantry force that kept inching forward even when you were sure they should have been exhausted, a human wave that never quite broke. And behind that relentless line of men was something even worse, waiting to fall on your head with mathematical precision, a rain of steel measured out in yards and seconds, moving just ahead of their boots. If the rhythm of attack was what German soldiers felt on their skin at the front, then behind the lines there was a quieter but equally dangerous system at work. The way the Allies, and the Germans themselves, classified and interpreted the Canadians through intelligence reports and logistical tables. On the German side, this was not about propaganda. The reports we have today were written for commanders, not for the public. In them, the Americans were usually tied to the word equipment, guns, tanks, aircraft. The British were associated with persistence. The Canadians, though, were tagged with short, chilling phrases. Aggressive. Do not tire. Do not pause. Comments like, they attack in weather when no one should be fighting, or they do not acknowledge the natural pauses of battle, were not tactical critiques but psychological warnings to relief units. Brace yourselves. This opponent is not like the others you have seen. German intelligence branches gradually built a separate file for the troops with the maple leaf patch. They logged how often they attacked at night, how well they absorbed artillery fire, how fast they could reform after being hit. When the map showed Canadians on the other side of the line, the attached recommendations were usually harsher. Strengthen defences, pre-register more artillery. Do not expect them to quit just because they lose a large share of their men in the opening wave. Over time, that file became a kind of self-fulfilling curse. The moment a unit heard, "You're facing Canadians," many officers were already imagining the worst, and that psychology seeped into every small decision made on the battlefield. Among the Allies, the view was very different, but just as cold-blooded. To British and American High Command, Canada was not just another ally, it was a special card in the deck, a force reliable enough to hand the hardest jobs to, but not the direct sons of London or Washington. Sending a British division into a meat grinder could trigger a political crisis at the heart of the empire. Sending American troops meant explaining the body count to Congress and a roaring press. Canada, although respected, occupied a strange in-between space, part of the family, yet slightly apart. Logistics helped shape that role. Canada could not fill fuel and ammo depots on its own like the United States, but it was plugged into the vast supply network of the British Empire and Lend-Lease. That allowed Canadian generals to order exactly what suited a shock infantry doctrine: high-quality artillery, solid communications, and just enough vehicles to bring the infantry to the start line, then leave the rest to rifles and grenades. Instead of trying to build a fully mechanized army like the Americans, they chose to pour steel into the tools that directly served the breakthrough: field guns, self-propelled artillery, shells, and forward observation gear. Their supply chain, as a result, had a distinctly surgical feel. It was not spread everywhere across Europe, but wherever Canadians showed up, ammunition dumps rarely ran dry. Their gunners, inheriting the lessons of Vimy Ridge from the First World War, were given enough shells to run those dense creeping barrages, curtains of fire that crept forward just ahead of their own men. Farther back, field telephones, radios, and observation posts tied everything into a nervous system in which each battery was a precise gear in a larger machine. Germans, who were proud of their own artillery, were forced to admit that the Canadians fire as if they are holding a ruler over the ground. Underneath all of that ran Canada's own domestic politics, something a frontline soldier rarely thought about, but which shaped the orders landing on his desk. In Ottawa, arguments raged over conscription and how many men to send overseas. Farmers, factory workers, French-speaking and English-speaking communities, not everyone was eager to see their sons shipped into the fire. The irony was that the harder it was to persuade the public, the more incentive generals had to prove that the blood already spent was not wasted. Every stubborn victory in Ortona, every strip of beach seized at Juneau, every flooded dike forced in the Scheldt could be held up as a ticket for Canada to claim a real seat at the table after the war, a seat paid for in lives. Commanders like Guy Simons understood that calculus very well. They did not just accept tough assignments, they went looking for them, knowing that if they succeeded, the maple leaf would be planted squarely in places that journalists and historians could not ignore. On the map table, that was grand strategy. Down in the mud, for the infantryman with a soaked pack on his back, it boiled down to something much simpler. Once again, we're the ones going in first. Out of that tangle of intelligence assessments, supply priorities, and politics came a hard reality. When a campaign stalled, when planes and tanks were not enough to break the deadlock, the quiet solution was often, bring in the Canadians. And the first time that idea was pushed to its limits was inside the cold, narrow stone walls of a little Mediterranean town called Ortona, a place where battles were no longer measured in miles but in rooms. The first thing Canadian soldiers noticed when they stepped into Ortona wasn't the smell of gunpowder, but the damp scent of limestone and plaster. The Italian town sat on a hillside with narrow streets, thick stone houses, and windows as small as loopholes. From afar, it looked like a Mediterranean postcard. From a soldier's eye level, it looked like a meat grinder built out of brick. Inside were German paratroopers, veterans from Russia and North Africa, dug in, wired with mines, and hiding machine guns in every dark corner a paranoid mind could imagine. The first Canadian assault went exactly by the old textbook. Tanks in front, infantry hugging their flanks, pushing up the main street. And just as the Germans hoped, hell opened up after only a few dozen meters. From second-story windows, MG-42 machine guns spat out bursts so fast they sounded like ripping cloth. Anti-tank charges blew under the treads, spraying steel and masonry into the faces of the men running beside the armor. Bodies went down and slid along a road now covered in dust and blood. Anyone who tried to dash out to drag a friend back instantly became the perfect moving target for a sniper who had been waiting all day for that exact moment. In those first hours, Ortona lived up to its reputation as a street-fighting death trap. Every road was a shooting lane, every intersection a potential minefield, every meter gained paid for in bodies. That was exactly what the Germans wanted, to force the enemy into long, straight kill corridors, where mines and machine guns could chew up human beings and grind their morale into powder. If the Canadians kept fighting that way, Ortona would become a smaller version of Stalingrad. The only real difference on the shattered buildings would be the maple leaf instead of the hammer and sickle. The turning point did not come from some grand, stirring order, but from a very simple observation about the buildings themselves. One infantry team, pinned down by gunfire as they tried to cross a street, scrambled back into the house they were using as a temporary strongpoint. Catching their breath, they finally noticed the obvious. The walls in this town were shared, thick but brittle under explosives. Standing between two cold stone walls, a Canadian NCO looked at the house next door, likely hiding a machine gun team, and realized that the safest path forward wasn't the street under his boots, but the wall right beside him. From that moment, Ortona became a live laboratory for a new way of fighting, mouse-holing. Instead of gambling their lives sprinting across open streets, Canadian troops used explosives, anti-tank weapons, or even direct fire from supporting guns to punch holes big enough to crawl through from one house to the next. Before stepping through, they tossed in grenades, listened to the blast roll off stone and furniture, then dived into the smoke, spraying the room with submachine gun fire and finishing anything that still moved with bayonets or knives. To the men doing it, This wasn't some grand, new doctrine, it was a chain of raw sensations, their faces burning from lime dust, ears ringing after each detonation, shoulders aching from smashing rifle butts into crumbling plaster, knees banging off slick stone steps smeared with blood. They crawled through jagged holes, helmets scraping the edges with a metallic squeal, surrounded by the mixed smell of gunpowder, sweat, and burning wool. Sometimes, before the dust had even settled, the first thing they saw in the next room was a German paratrooper turning around, just as stunned. At that distance, the gap between living and dying shrank to the speed of a single trigger pull. On the other side, German soldiers suddenly found themselves in a nightmare role reversal. They had prepared to fire down streets, to blow up tanks at intersections. Instead, the enemy was coming from a direction that didn't exist on their map, through the wall at their backs. Some Fallschirmjäger units reported hearing dull thumps and hissing on the far side of a wall, and then the wall simply disappeared in a blast. Before they could swing their guns toward the gap, men with maple leaves on their sleeves were already diving through like home invaders, not textbook assault troops. When even the walls, the last thing between you and the open, could no longer be trusted, the very idea of a safe position evaporated. In doctrinal terms, mouse-holing was the step from a flat, two-dimensional map into three-dimensional space. Instead of moving along the street, the Canadians moved through the building blocks, turning every row of houses into a temporary tunnel network of their own making. Psychologically, it sent a brutally simple message to the Germans. You do not have a place to hide. Even if you're too scared to step into the street, we will come to you through the wall you think is protecting you. The victory at Ortona did not come quickly, cleanly, or cheaply. It was bought with heavy casualties, but it marked the first time the Germans were forced to concede that the Canadians were not just reckless out in open fields, they were also willing to bend the rules of the game inside every single room. And those same men who had learned to eat a stone town one wall and one stairwell at a time, once thrown into a drowned black mud landscape at the edge of the North Sea, would prove that even knee-deep water and sucking clay were not thick enough barriers to slow their advance. If Ortona was where the Canadians learned how to eat a town one wall at a time, then the Scheldt and Normandy were where they learned how to drop a full steel storm on the enemy's head and walk right behind it. For the Germans, waiting for a Canadian attack did not just mean listening for bootsteps, it meant listening for the artillery that came first to clear the way. In the Scheldt, the storm of steel began far away. Along the wind-lashed dikes, Canadian guns were packed in tight, 25-pounder field pieces, heavy artillery, mortars, all linked by field telephone lines like the nervous system of some huge creature. On the map, artillery officers shaded bands of colour to show each minute of fire. Down in the mud, the infantry heard only one very short order. When the wall of fire is about 100 meters in front of you, you get up and run after it. The difference was not in how many shells they fired, the Americans could fire more, but in how Canada turned each barrage into a surgical tool. They used the creeping barrage, a moving wall of fire, with almost clock-like rhythm. Every few dozen seconds, the line of explosions jumped forward a fixed distance, usually just over 100 meters. A mistake of only a few seconds was enough to turn the infantry behind it into victims of their own guns, but Canadian batteries rarely slipped. To the Germans, it felt like the ground in front of them was being ploughed up in strips, and as soon as the blasts in one strip faded, figures were already pouring in right behind it, giving them no time to raise their heads. In his diary, one German sergeant wrote that their artillery is like the blade of a bulldozer. Wherever it goes, everything is flattened, and right behind the blade are men in helmets with the maple leaf. That was not exaggeration. In some battles, the heaviest German losses did not come from duels with rifles and machine guns, but from those minutes spent hugging the mud, feeling the whole world shake, only to have Canadian infantry drop into their trenches before their nerves could settle. The storm of steel simply did not allow their morale to recover. Normandy pushed that idea to a new level. When the Canadians came ashore on Juno, They ran straight into what the Germans considered the gold standard of defensive firepower, the MG-42, a machine gun that could spit more than 1,000 rounds a minute and turn an entire beach into an invisible mesh of lead. But once they got past the sand and the fight moved into the bocage, hedgerows, tiny fields broken up by raised earth banks, the gunners again became the conductors of the battle. The terrain chopped the battlefield into small boxes, forcing Canada to link each platoon to indirect fire so that every hedge, every mound of earth, had its own assigned share of shells. On Verrières Ridge, where wet clay clung to Canadian boots as if trying to drag them back into the ground, their guns fired at such a density that German survivors later said, "Even when the shells missed, the noise alone wore you out." Facing Tiger tanks and SS infantry, the Canadians could not win with thicker armour. They won by turning every metre of approach into a probability problem in which the defenders' chance of survival dropped sharply with each adjusted salvo. Logistics were what made that storm of steel possible day after day. Shells do not fall out of the sky by themselves. They arrive by truck, by ship, by landing craft grinding up onto wet sand and mud. And on Allied priority lists, Canadian artillery usually ranked very high. British and American generals knew that if they wanted to borrow Canada as the chisel to crack a line, they had to feed the guns properly. The result was that wherever the maple leaf appeared on the map, ammunition dumps tended to be fuller, field telephone lines thicker, and more forward observers stood on exposed ridges, men who were willing to stick their heads up so they could redraw, in real time, the path of that moving wall of fire. Alongside all of this came a steady drumbeat of nervous strain on the German side. A machine gun nest can withstand several infantry assaults if the attackers rely only on rifles and grenades. But when every time they spotted a target and fired a few bursts, their position was immediately pinned by a Canadian observer, and a few minutes later dozens of shells were crashing down around the bunker, the proud confidence in their wonder weapon, MG-42, evaporated. People often say Canadian infantry were aggressive. By this point in the war, what truly terrified the Germans was not just the men, but the way men and machines were fused together. A tireless attacking force walking right behind an artillery system capable of turning a map into a schedule of executions, box by box. And when even that storm of steel was not enough to make them stop, one question hung over every slope and hedgerow in Normandy. Somewhere, someday, would that pressure finally exceed the breaking point? The crest of Verrières Ridge that day did not look like a strategic objective on a map. To the men crawling up its slope, it was mud, rain, and small clumps of grass glued to their fingers. The Normandy clay clung to Canadian boots in heavy chunks like lead, turning every step into a dragging pull, as if someone underground were grabbing their ankles and hauling them back down. Overhead, the clouds sagged low, pressing the whole sky down toward the earth. In all that grey, the only colour that really stood out was the sudden orange flashes spitting from German guns and machine gun barrels on the crest. A Canadian platoon lay flattened against the hillside. The distance to the top was not far on a soccer pitch. It would have been half a field, but up there sat an entire century of killing technology. MG-42, machine guns, mortars, and 88mm guns set back behind the line. Every time someone raised his head more than a few centimetres, a burst of fire tore through the air and punched deep into the wet ground. The sergeant was almost kissing the dirt, feeling each tiny clod of earth flicked up by bullets patter onto the back of his neck. He reached one hand behind him, touching shoulders to count 1, 2, 3, missing 2 men. He did not turn around. He just murmured, "Keep crawling. Do not stop your hands." Behind them, Canadian artillery stepped its fire up the ridge in timed increments measured on a stopwatch. The gunners could not see what was happening on the slope. They only heard the forward observer over the line. "Drop it a little lower. Shift 200 meters to the right." Every order meant dozens of shells arcing out, shredding a layer of earth, snapping trees, ripping open makeshift bunkers. But there was one thing the artillery could not do. It could not pick up the exhausted bodies of those infantrymen and set them on the crest. That part was up to the hands clawing at the mud. Between the crashes of the barrage, there were sounds much smaller but far clearer to anyone in the fight. The metallic click as a German gunner pulled his bolt back into battery, the rasp of a pack scraping over wet ground, the tight, ragged breathing of the man next to you trying not to cough and give away your position. When the guns began to creep their fire line past the summit, a strange, relative quiet fell, a deadly gap between the curtain of explosions and the line of machine guns above. Everyone in the platoon understood. This was the decision point. If they did not fill that silence with their own bodies, the Germans would rise, drop their muzzles, and turn the hillside into a live fire range. They got up together without anyone needing to shout. From a crawling position, the whole line surged forward like runners who had left the blocks half a beat late. Mud flew behind their boots, backs hunched under the sheer weight of everything they carried. The first man in line took the first hit, a sudden jerk backward, and then he collapsed, his pack flipping over, his rifle spinning out of his hand. But right behind him, the next man never broke stride. He simply planted his foot on a patch of ground that had just been stained a different colour. On the crest, German machine guns screamed, trying to make up for the minutes they had been smothered by artillery. In most armies, this is the moment when instinct wins over doctrine. You see your friends go down, you see the path to the top turn into a maze of craters and bodies, and you look for a place to lie flat, to wait for new orders, to pray for the guns to come back and save you. But inside the heads of those Canadians on Verrières Ridge, something else had been wired in. Memories of bodies found with their hands tied behind their backs at Abbaye d'Ardennes, stories passed from mouth to mouth about prisoners shot by the SS. They did not say it out loud, but every step up the slope was an answer as heavy as the mud on their boots. No more backing down. When the actual edge of the crest was only a few body lengths away, the whole world shrank into little snapshots. A private saw, right in front of him, a pair of German boots sticking out from the lip of a trench. He did not look up to see the man's face. He just drove his whole body into the rim of the trench, swinging his rifle sideways. Canadian and German bodies slammed together and slid down the same smear of mud. They grappled, faces and noses packed with clay. By the time the gunfire around them began to thin out, the only way to tell who was the feel of the patch on a shoulder maple leaf or crooked cross. Elsewhere along the crest, an MG-42 was still roaring, its barrel glowing red-hot. The German gunner felt the stock trembling in his hands like a wild animal, every belt of ammunition pouring more lead down the slope. He was so locked onto his targets downhill that he never sensed the shape slipping up to the edge of his trench. A hand grabbed his collar and yanked him backward. He had just enough time to see a bayonet flash once in the rain before everything went dark. For the Canadian who had jumped into that trench, it was not some heroic moment to boast about, it was a movement he had drilled 1,000 times on a training range. The only difference was that this time the target screamed. When the shooting on the crest of Verrières finally shifted from one long roar to scattered, isolated cracks, the Germans at the base of the hill understood what was happening without needing a telephone message. They had been the ones charging slopes like this before. They had watched other armies break and run halfway up. This time, the people coming at them did not break. They snapped, but they snapped on the ridgeline, not in the middle of the climb. Strictly speaking, Verrières Ridge was not a clean, decisive victory. Canadian losses there were so heavy that officers would still be arguing about it years later. But psychologically, it was a manifesto written in mud and blood. This was the threshold where, even under SS firepower and tanks, Canadian infantry chose to keep climbing. And from the moment silhouettes with maple leaves on their helmets stood on that wet, smoky crest, every political decision and every casualty report written behind them had to wrestle with the same question: what kind of bill would come due for that level of determination in the days that followed? As soon as the guns on Verrières and the slopes around Caen fell quiet, the first thing that rolled down to the lower lines was not a feeling of victory, but silence. A silence as heavy as the canvas draped over a truck full of bodies. On paper, the front recorded phrases like "objective held" or "part of the high ground secured," but down in the mud, what everyone really saw were the gaps in the line. The formation that had stepped off in the morning with 3 full ranks, by late afternoon mustered only 1.5. In Canadian platoons, the evening roll call ran longer than usual. Some names were called a second, a third time, and still there was no present in reply. The ledgers labelled it casualties, but to those still alive it looked much more concrete. A steel helmet lying by the lip of a trench, a greatcoat cut open for a hasty bandage, a rifle nobody bothered to pick up because everyone knew its owner was not coming back. Many units did not collapse, but they were ground down to the point where a full company became a company on paper, patched together with replacements who had been in Europe for only a few weeks. The first reaction inside Canadian headquarters was a mix of pride and unease. They had reports to send up the chain and across to their allies. Canadian forces held the ridge against SS counterattacks, drove the deepest wedge on the first day, completed the mission under severe weather conditions. Those lines gave Ottawa something to say to the public, proof that their son's blood was not being spilled for nothing on the far side of the Atlantic. But attached to those reports were thick casualty tables that forced every general who read them to ask a hard question: if we keep this pace, how much fighting strength will we have left in 6 months, in a year? On the German side, the shock came in a different form. They were used to opponents who knew the rules, who understood when to pull back, when to trade ground for lives. Facing the Canadians, they ran into an enemy that seemed willing to push one notch further past what common sense would recommend. As frontline reports came in, German staff officers found themselves, for the first time, using words like stubborn and refusing to withdraw even in unfavorable conditions to describe the other side. To them, it looked like tactical madness, and yet, each time that happened, the red arrow on the map stayed in its new spot, higher up, deeper into German territory. The Canadians' early war mindset, the excitement of finally being used after years of training, began to pick up a grey tint. They still advanced, still fought, still executed drills they could perform in their sleep. But between battles, crouched in shallow shell scrapes, conversations kept circling back to the names that had been crossed off. One soldier looked down at his mud-caked boots and joked, bone-dry, "If we have to climb a few more hills like that, make sure you send my feet back to Canada ahead of me." The whole laughed, but everyone knew it was not just a joke. For the Allies, Canada's success had an immediate effect on planning. When lists of available units passed from hand to hand, the names with Canadian next to them started to get underlined. They became the reliable choice for any mission that needed constant infantry pressure under heavy fire. That meant that in the next rounds of attacks, from widening the Normandy bridgehead to pushing through the Scheldt, the maple leaf flag would show up again in the ugliest little squares on the map, the ones other commanders were not eager to own. For Germany, the short-term consequence of battles like Verrières and the Scheldt was a subtle but clear shift in how they built their defences. On sectors where they knew Canadians were opposite, they crammed in more guns, more mines, more elite troops, not because they believed that would stop them completely, but because they understood that if they did not, that stretch of line would be gnawed through faster than the rest. At the same time, the muttered wisdom in the dugouts changed tone. The Americans will blow you apart with artillery, the British will wear you down until you drop, and the Canadians, they keep hitting you even after you think the battle is over. The early war arrogance, the belief that the Wehrmacht could manage any opponent on the Western Front, began to crack. Every time they faced Canada, that crack widened a little more. One German lieutenant, captured and questioned, put it this way: "We were prepared to die, but we were not prepared to see someone else so willing to die that much just to gain a few hundred meters." It was not a compliment. It was a confession of a new kind of fear, the fear of an enemy who refused to play by the survival rules you had spent your whole life learning. For Canada, the price of the shock troops' reputation was paid immediately in rows of white headstones growing on the outskirts of Caen, along the Scheldt dikes, and beside muddy roads in Italy. Every battle added a little more strategic prestige, but shaved off one more thin layer of the generation they had sent across the ocean. And from that mismatch between arrows moving forward on the map and empty spaces in villages back home, a slow, nagging question began to form. What kind of long-term mark would this style of warfare leave on their doctrine, their politics, and the way the world saw Canada once the guns finally went quiet? In smoke-filled rooms after the war, when generals began turning battlefield memories into reports and doctrine, the name Canada appeared with a strange color. It was not an industrial giant like the United States, not an old empire like Britain, but every serious summary of the Western Front had to give it a chapter under assault forces. On the campaign maps, the red arrows marked with a maple leaf usually sat on the worst spots: beaches under heavy fire, stone hill towns, flooded dikes, dark forests. Strategically, that left behind a dangerous legacy, the precedent that Canada was the country willing to do the dirty, difficult work. In early Cold War plans inside NATO, that image did not just vanish. A nation that had proved it could send a small volunteer force to fight on equal or better terms than German infantry was easy to imagine as a reserve dagger on some secondary front. Few people said it aloud, but behind closed doors, the willingness to pay in blood at Ortona or in the Scheldt was a kind of political capital that Canada itself struggled to manage. Spend it too freely, and the country would exhaust itself, lock it away, and it would feel like denying the story written with so much sacrifice. On the industrial side, the experience of feeding a shock infantry force pulled Canada far deeper into the military-economic orbit than its image as a gentle dominion suggested. To sustain those signature creeping barrages and that precise rain of steel, the country had pushed its factories, mines, and rail lines to the limit. The result, after the guns fell silent, was that Canada was no longer just an agricultural appendage to the British Empire, but an economy with a defence industry, with engineers and workers who had lived by building guns, artillery, and shells. When the world shifted into an era of peacekeeping and proxy wars, that same infrastructure quietly underpinned new missions, this time with blue berets instead of mud-streaked steel helmets. Doctrinally, Canada's imprint was clearest in three areas: infantry, artillery coordination, urban combat, and the use of elite units to punch holes in enemy lines. Young officers in many countries, studying the battles of Ortona, the Scheldt and Verrières, learned that artillery was not just a punishment tool for wide areas, but could become a finely tuned blade if welded tightly to the infantry's advance. Military textbooks now cite the creeping barrage as a classic example, and almost always devote a few pages to how the Canadians used it. The same goes for city fighting, once seen as a nightmare to avoid at all costs. After Ortona, it began to be studied more systematically, not just fighting down streets, but drilling through walls, slicing blocks into sectors, peeling a town apart building by building. Another, subtler long-term effect was the recognition that small volunteer units, highly trained and tightly bonded, could have strategic impact equal to or greater than huge but loosely knit formations. Many smaller states, building their forces after the war, took that lesson to heart. Instead of trying to imitate American or Soviet scale, they focused on creating a few spearhead brigades, hoping to become a miniature version of what Canada had demonstrated, dangerous enough that everyone at the table had to factor them in. Inside Canada itself, the cost of being the infantry the Germans feared most was paid in a quieter, more personal currency, a long internal negotiation over national identity. After the war, the official image Ottawa wanted to project was that of a peaceful, multicultural country, fond of compromise, fond of sending peacekeepers to calm fires elsewhere. But beneath that paint lay the memories of those who had survived and of families whose sons did not come home of a time when Canada was the name called whenever someone had to go first into the worst square on the map. Those two images do not cancel each other out, but they do create tension. How does a nation call itself gentle when its most recent history shows that, when needed, it once fielded some of the most fearsome soldiers on the battlefield? For Germany, the long-term lesson had a tragic shade. They were forced to admit that even a finely tuned military machine can be bent out of shape by an opponent who does not follow the reasonable tempo of war. Later generation officers teaching about the Western Front used Canada as a cautionary example. Never build a plan on the assumption that your enemy values lives the way you do. There will always be adversaries who, for political reasons, out of hatred, or simply to prove a point, are willing to pay more. And above all the strategy, doctrine, and industry, the true legacy of Canadian infantry in the Second World War lies in a moral question that still echoes. Can a country rise into the ranks of serious powers by proving it can kill so effectively that even its enemies fear it, then turn around and tell the world it is a guardian of peace without leaving scars in its collective mind? The answer does not sit in classified files. It lives in personal memories, and in rows of white headstones lining beaches, dikes, and hillsides where the maple leaf once flew. Picture an early morning many years after the war. On a hillside in Normandy, mist still clings to rows of identical white headstones. No more artillery, no more MG-42, only the sound of wind sliding through the grass. On one grave, someone has planted a small flag with a red maple leaf, its edge frayed by rain and weather. A passerby might see it as nothing more than part of the scenery, a beautiful cemetery, a bright flag, a blue sky. But for those who once stood on the slopes of Verrières or along the dikes of the Scheldt, every little maple leaf like that is an unanswered moral question. Because in the end, what made German soldiers fear the Canadians was not magic or some notion of a superior race, but a cold combination of training, willpower, and a readiness to pay the price. A small nation proved to the world that it could hit very hard when its back was against the wall. The question is, after throwing that punch, what kind of people did they choose to become? Would they keep defining strength by their ability to make others afraid, or by their ability to keep their children and grandchildren from ever having to learn that lesson in blood? Today, when we mention Canada, the familiar images are blue berets, peacekeeping convoys, a quiet country of forests and lakes. The contrast with the wild men described in Wehrmacht reports might make us smile, but it should also send a little shiver down the spine. It was ordinary people, from peaceful places like that, who once turned stone villages, muddy dikes, and cold beaches into places where the enemy whispered to each other. If it's them coming, the battle is already over. Maybe the most mature way to handle this story is neither to glorify the violence nor to pretend it never happened, but to remember it exactly as it was. The next time you see a red maple leaf on a travel backpack or someone's jacket, remember that this symbol once appeared in some of the worst places on the map of the 20th century, and that is precisely why our responsibility in the 21st century is to make sure places like that never appear again.